What do a chocolate factory owner, a cannibal psychiatrist, and a well-meaning scientist all have in common? They are the rarely seen versions of a villain that is also rarely discussed, because they prefer it that way, honestly. They are the evasive expert, a master of logic, concealment, and psychological sleight of hand. So, welcome to Inner Worlds, Outer Stories. I am Kristina Wiltsee. I am a life alchemist, and I love to work with people, my clients, and otherwise on moving their own inner spaces of villainy all the way over to the legend. So we look at movies, we look at movie characters, and we try and garner whatever lessons we can from pop culture and different stories that exist in the world in order to be able to actually move and change our own self-development. So we're doing the evasive expert today. The evasive expert is not your typical villain. They don't scream and storm, they speak in precision and riddles and rules, and they exist as a paradox. They are deeply emotional, but they are rarely emotional. And their greatest fear is being revealed as fragile. Their greatest defense is expertise. These characters represent the rejection wound, and their central narrative is, I must hide my needs or I will be rejected. They operate from the solar plexus and human design, and they are constantly scanning for control, clarity, and safe distance. And in the Enneagram, they live as the type 5s. They are withdrawn, analytical, craving inner resources over connection. So, before we get into the characters, particularly of Willy Wonka and Hannibal Lecter, which are going to be the two main evasive experts that we are looking at today, let's go over the different faces of the evasive expert. If you've seen any of my other videos, you know that every single one of these villains has different stages that they exist in. They each have a pinnacle villain form, which is the absolute worst form. They have a successful antagonist, which is usually not as bad as a pinnacle villain. It's actually one that may even be successful in life because they've used this strategy. There is the wounded child, which is the more victim form, and then there is the covert form, which we often find ourselves in if we have lived amongst a villain and we are trying to find something that feels okay with regards to them. How are we existing in regards to somebody who's very a pinnacle villain in our life? Oh, we're going to go to this covert or dormant form. As with all of these arcs, especially when these villains are actually able to find redemption, we find that there is a shift from these more villainous forms, and then the hero comes in, and the hero is how we use that self-development work to invert entirely what it is that we're going from the villain form to the legend form. In the same way that the villain has these three different types, the successful antagonist, the wounded child, and the dormant, the covert, we also have those three for the legend, which we won't get into today. That's beyond whatever it is, but we are looking right now at villainy and what particularly Willy Wonka, we won't mention Dr. Jekyll, but Dr. Jekyll is a very good example of this one, and Hannibal Lecter all have in common when it comes to the evasive expert. So, starting first, the evasive expert. The evasive expert is that pinnacle villain. They maintain a rigid wall between their intellectual self and their dark passenger. Think Hannibal Lecter when he's so very helpful to Clarice, and yet when we see that he is able to get out of his confinement, then he obviously becomes a cannibal again, and he becomes a worse version of himself. I'm using only the Silence of the Lambs and not the significant canon of work that exists about Hannibal Lecter. The evasive expert rarely explodes, but when they do, it is terrifying. The successful antagonist of this arc is the Overthinker. They distract from emotional intimacy by researching everything. If there's a feeling, there must be a white paper for it, and we must be able to explain it. The third, which is the wounded child, is the fragile. The fragile or the sensitive is that child who just feels so incredibly deeply. They feel so incredibly deeply, and yet they have consciously decided not to cry. That's one of the strategies that they take on, is because when they are in their most fragile form, they are incredibly sad or they are incredibly deeply feeling, and they perceive themselves as weak when they are in that. So oftentimes what we see, and I've seen this actually happen with people, is that they will create strategies that make them look like they are not sensitive anymore. The covert form of this one is the compartmentalizer. They feel deeply, but they wall it off. They often are extremely covert in the sense that no one knows what's behind their smile. They may be masking entirely. If you're a neurodivergent folk, you may notice oh, I have these really, really deep feeling parts and I'm going to totally appear as if everything is okay on the surface. All right, so we are going to be using Hannibal and Willy Wonka as the two examples of the evasive expert. This is different than the typical videos I do because a lot of the time I will take one person or one movie and kind of go through the whole thing, especially if there's somebody who's in current pop culture, but there are not a lot of evasive experts out there. So I want to use both Hannibal Lecter and Willy Wonka, but primarily Willy Wonka as the example for how you're going to understand all of these deep personas and what that looks like for you. So first we're going to start with the evasive expert. The evasive expert is that pinnacle villain. They are the worst version of this. They are the center of darkness that people who are in this arc and haven't been able to move out of it are in. They are maintaining a very rigid wall between an intellectual self, deeply, deeply intellectual. They probably think that logic is the only thing that's valid, and a dark passenger. Now, the dark passenger can take many, many different forms. In the case of Hannibal Lecter, the dark passenger is the cannibal part of Hannibal Lecter. In the case of Willy Wonka, he has a very tightly held demeanor. And I'm talking about the Gene Wilder version of Willy Wonka and his depiction of it, not necessarily the Roald Dahl version or the Johnny Depp version, or even the Timothée Chalamet, who doesn't really show this arc at all whatsoever. I'm talking about the Gene Wilder from the most popular movie, which I would say was the most popular and the best, arguably, Willy Wonka. The evasive expert, and to talk a little bit more about the dark passenger, there's a scene in Willy Wonka when he's going through the tunnel and there's all these really dark images. To me, that is the essence of the dark passenger. It is this place where you are effectively experiencing a lot of darkness that exists in the world and what you believe to be your darker nature. Most of the time, this isn't actually a darker nature, but when you don't allow your deeply feeling parts to actually express themselves in the world, they kind of fester and corrupt and turn into what is a dark passenger. I am talking to you that I have actually worked with people who will create entirely different families, who will become workaholics and basically wall off anything. They will completely avoid their family because it's so difficult for them to be deeply feeling. People who will have dark criminal personas that they hide from their family, and when they're with their family, everything's all in control and they're just like, where everything's fantastic, but they have this wall and this dark passenger. And I'm telling you, actual genuine people who do this. We hear these stories all the time in movies and different things like that, but there are actual examples of people who do this in real life. And this to me is the example of that. It becomes that their deep feelings, and we'll get to this in a second when we get to the wounded child, but their deep feelings are so big that they are not capable of actually dealing with those deep feelings. So they create a playground, a dark passenger playground, in order to express their deep feelings, which often end up in a very corrupted way because they feel as if they are not being scrutinized and that they are not being watched, so they can therefore do anything. You guys may know of these people. So this is the worst version. The worst version is the person who's created the other family. Their dark passenger has been allowed to run amok in their life, and they've created a very strong wall between these two sides. Willy Wonka does this particularly when his tightly held demeanor cracks, when Charlie fails his test. He erupts in cold precision. You get nothing, you lose. Good day, sir. It is sudden, sharp, and emotionally disoriented.
So you get nothing. You lose. Good day, sir.
Right? And that you can look back at a lot of the interviews that Gene Wilder did when he was depicting this. He did not tell the actor that he was going to do this and have this type of reaction. So the reaction that Charlie has in this moment is actually genuine. And we see that there's a lot of that in Willy Wonka, this kind of unhinged, I'm going to pretend as if everything is okay and be highly intellectual and very intelligent. But this deeply feeling stuff is actually very, very angry. And we'll see how that looks. All right. And then the overthinker. The overthinker is the one that distracts from their emotional intimacy by researching everything. And if there's a feeling, there must be a white paper for it. There's a white paper for this feeling. I have this really deep feeling and I don't know what to do with it. So they're going to try and intellectualize that as much as they humanly possible. They can do everything that they can to basically say, okay, there has to be a reason for how this feels. I am going to do everything I can to make sure that I understand this and intellectualize my feelings as much as possible. People who are really intelligent, who may have high IQs or considered gifted, especially if they are gifted and they are neurodivergent in some way, I find that the overthinker is a very strong quality of this person. This person may go to therapy, and this person may find that they are able to figure out and basically explain all of their feelings to a therapist, and yet they are completely incapable inside of themselves of actually feeling the feelings that they are intellectualizing. Willy Wonka drowns every moment of the entirety of the movie in intellectual riddles and philosophical quips. Instead of giving anything to the children, he basically buries them in cleverness, and anytime they ask him any questions, anything that may be difficult for him to answer, he automatically hits it with an intellectual perspective, like, oh, we are the dreamer of dreams, and we are the, that would be a clip that would go to there, as opposed to me butchering that paraphrase. Maybe it has validity that he's trying to use this as his tactic. It is his character, but it is 100% an indication of that overthinker who is trying to avoid intimacy and tenderness with another person. And in order to connect, he is actually just spewing philosophy. The third persona in this, which is the wounded child, is the fragile. They are deeply feeling. Deeply feeling fragile, sensitive. They may cry. I met somebody once who basically said that they cried every single time that they were a kid whenever they got hurt in any way, shape, or form, and they couldn't stop it. And so they spent an entire summer just punching a punching bag in order to be able to rid themselves of their desire to cry when they got hurt. So many men, I find that men are most often evasive experts, are finding that it's difficult for them to express emotionally and with sensitivity, and therefore they use an armor to protect themselves from it, and they try to train their body to suppress it. That deeply feeling person is still inside. That deeply feeling person still deserves to be integrated and balanced in their system. And when it's not, it becomes that dark passenger that pinnacle villain experiences. Willy Wonka does this. There are some very clear moments when you can see that Willy Wonka really cares, especially once Charlie has his moment in which Charlie is refusing to take the money or to do anything along those lines to actually sabotage or reject Willy Wonka by giving the everlasting gobstopper to Slugworth.
So shines a good deed in a weary world.
Charlie.
That is the moment in which Willy feels as if he can finally trust and he's not going to be rejected by Charlie, and therefore you can see the true intimacy that he has. I would also say that you probably can't see at all the wounded child, a sensitive version of this, other than the fact that you can imagine that somebody who would create an entire world like this and who would also go and save all of the Oompa Loompas has got to have a sensitive side, has to have a side for those who've been rejected or those who've had other things. And so you can see little tiny indications that that's the case. So the compartmentalizer is the covert form of this. The compartmentalizer feels deeply, but they wall it off. They're incredibly good at walling things off. And it is extremely covert. When you see them at work, they're one way. When you see them at home, they're another way. When you see them at church, they're another way. When you see them someone else, no one knows who is their true self. They have they don't even know who their true self is because they've compartmentalized the deeply feeling part of them, maybe the dark passenger part. They've deeply, and even if it isn't a dark passenger, they've compartmentalized their life. And oftentimes what will happen over time is that they will find that there is a part of their life that they prefer. And so that's where the workaholic tendency tends to come out. I would rather be at work because I don't have to deal with the emotions of my children, which are too much for me. I feel their emotions in the room and it's too difficult, or I can't handle their emotional state. So I'm going to spend all my time at work because there's a wall in which I don't have to deal with other people's emotional considerations. And therefore I'm going to stay behind this wall. So what we recognize is that Willy Wonka's factory is a representation of his compartmentalization. Every single room is so incredibly different. And yes, you could say, well, these are the different aspects of invention. But if we were to go into a deep dive of what Willy Wonka actually means, I feel like we would be able to see The desire, the cleaning aspect. I always love this. The cleaning aspect is like when they're on the vehicle that's going through the cleaner, this desire to just be able to get rid of anything messy whatsoever. The desire to be able to have everything be pristine and very clean, and he's very fastidious about everything. You can see that the factory is a representation of his mind, and it is extremely compartmentalized, and every single part is very, very different. So we actually see the physical representation of the covert form of this villain. And so I mentioned Hannibal Lecter. Dexter Morgan, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are all examples of this villain who wear a mask, and they are going to basically use that mask to use their intelligence to protect themselves ultimately. Just a moment about Hannibal Lecter. We recognize that Hannibal Lecter, he's in a confinement. He is compartmentalized when he is sitting in jail. And when he is compartmentalized sitting in jail, we recognize that he is able to be his intellectual self. And he uses all these questions to turn them back on Clarice, to basically psychoanalyze her. He uses his psychoanalysis and his role as the psychoanalyst to basically appear functional in whatever way, or even appear endearing in whatever way. And it isn't until he uncompartmentalizes himself and he's allowed to do whatever he wants that we see the worst version of who he could possibly be. He's able to get into the mind of other dark passengers like Buffalo Bill because of the fact that he has developed his dark passenger so deeply, and he is intellectualized, even turn his intellectual notion he's been intellectualizing his own dark passenger. So he is very, very good and, foremost thought leader in terms of understanding the dark passengers of others. Dexter Morgan. Dexter is a great example of this. Dexter also has a little bit of the obedient critic, which we talked about in the Elphaba arc, but Dexter is extremely compartmentalized, and he uses his job and his work to compartmentalize his dark passenger, right? And yet we recognize that constantly so much of the arc of Dexter Morgan is about this idea that there's this overlap, that he can't actually continue to keep up this compartmentalization forever, and that he can't delude himself into thinking that he can break up himself into all of these different parts and actually still keep them separate, because eventually they will come crashing into one another. So, villainy in disguise. The evasive expert rarely appears monstrous. They are often admired, respected, but their villainy shows in what they withhold. They withhold the truth, their heart, and the impact of their distance. They hurt others not by what they do, but what they refuse to show. They teach others to mistrust their instincts. They create labyrinths of control where no one, including themselves, can feel safe, because there is nothing that's really authentic. They are effectively continually rejecting other people and themselves, aspects of themselves, and therefore no one can ever really get to know them, so no one can actually just reject them at all. And so where do we actually see the hero come in? The hero comes in rarely within these three. Like I said, there are so many different examples of villains that are evasive experts, and we kind of are able to see them, but most of the time their arcs come without their willing participation, if you want to say that. The hero of this arc is the passionate. And the reason that we use the term hero is because the hero is the one who is capable of turning it all around. Just like in the hero's journey, and just like how we see everything work in the story structure of a hero's journey, in which there's a person, they're in ordinary circumstances, they live in the ordinary world, and then there's an inciting incident that effectively inverts their world, and then they go into this whole journey of the hero's journey, and by the end they can come out as a hero, or they can come out as a legend. The way that we think this is a slightly different structure, but it's the idea that a villain will orbit around a pinnacle villain, and they will just keep kind of fluctuating between all three of these different forms that I've described and the pinnacle villain. So when things get stressful or awful, they're falling right into the center of the pinnacle villain, and they are acting that out. But when things are a little bit better, maybe they're just compartmentalizing, or maybe they're just very sensitive. The hero asks that we invert that form, and that hero's journey is the process of inverting them so that they can actually have a different thing to surround themselves with. The legend is in this particular case, is the integrator. It is the person who recognizes that their emotions are actually valid and are actually a part of all of their logical equations, logical equations are not actually logical if they don't include emotion. And so let's talk a little bit about the hero. The hero is the passionate because a version of the expert who finally allows emotion to meet logic, who dissolves the line between feeling and knowing. And when they master their inner fusion, they become the integrator, which is the legend, someone who can navigate chaos and complexity with their full tool set. Where do we see Dexter, Dr. Jekyll, Hannibal, or even Willy Wonka come into their hero form? We don't really. Willy Wonka is able to integrate and actually create intimacy with Charlie. He's probably the one that is able to do it the most. When Charlie makes the effort not to reject or betray Willy Wonka, that's when he becomes this effusive person who actually integrates how he truly feels with the actions that he takes. When he takes Charlie into the elevator, he becomes the traveler, and he's able to kind of move into a more eternal child aspect of this, or a more childlike aspect of this. He's able to integrate everything about him into that moment once he recognizes that Charlie is not going to let him down, that Charlie is not going to do that, and he's able to actually express everything. That's where we see this flip. It's only in the last 5 minutes that we see Willy actually come into his legendary aspect of this. And we can only assume in the books that follow with Roald Dahl are very hard to take, even though they are technically canon for Willy Wonka, just simply because of the fact that they kind of, they go to different planets and there's all sorts of other things that happen in that respect. But purely from the movie, we see the legendary aspect of Willy once he fully accepts that he can trust Charlie, and he is going to be integrated into that again. Hannibal, we do not see that. We see that he embraces an aspect of himself in which he actually chooses at the end of The Silence of the Lambs to actually go after the corrupt or abusive FBI agent. That we see that there's a moment in that which he's actually maybe slightly integrating his dark passenger with his intellect, because he recognizes that this is, he almost takes on a Dexter Morgan type of perspective of, I'm going to only get rid of the bad guys. That could be thought of as a flip on that. And Dexter Morgan himself, I would say that Dexter is capable of doing a lot of other things when it comes to what his arc looks like. We're not going to look at him fully. We may look at him fully. If you like it and you want me to do one on Dexter, then I will, and I'll show more fully and go into details with examples of everything of his arc. I think that what we find is that the more that he finds that he can't compartmentalize, then he has to integrate both his sides, and he has to fully come into it, but not without a significant amount of loss that happens prior to that. So in a world that often rewards distance disguised as mastery, the evasive expert reminds us that there is no wisdom without vulnerability. There's no clarity without contact. To evolve beyond the expert, we must allow the passion back in. We must integrate our dark passenger with everything else. And you know what? If you've spent a long time having kept these two apart, it can be a really rough road. But it doesn't mean that it's not possible. So please leave comments, like, subscribe. We're a tiny channel. We're just growing. If you can do anything you can to help us, to comment, anything will help us come up in the algorithm so that people can actually find out whatever it is, whether you're a writer, whether you love movies, whether you love spirituality, whether on your self-development journey, whatever it is, please like and then share this with someone and tell them about us. And if you have any questions about the evasive expert, or you want me to go into more detail, I will be happy to do that. Thank you so much for joining us.